Welcome back to You Can't Say That in Court, a podcast by Rise Women's Legal Center. I'm Vicky Law.
And I'm Stephanie Melnick. We are your hosts as we continue this conversation about survivors of violence navigating the BC family law system. We recognize that the legal system we have in BC is colonial and causes harm to families, which disproportionately impacts Indigenous people.
By speaking openly about these harms, we hope to raise awareness about the challenges survivors face as they navigate the colonial family law system. Our podcast is an attempt to collectively identify the barriers and advocate for positive changes to be made. Thank you for joining. Our podcast series will discuss difficult topics such as gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. This includes physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and financial abuse. Please be aware that this is a thread that is woven throughout all the episodes, and we hope you will take care of yourselves however you need. Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 2 of You Can't Say That in Court. And today we have Haley back as well to talk about part 2 of the housing crisis and how survivors are navigating. In part 1, we highlighted the lots of challenges and barriers for survivors and how difficult it is for them to leave an abusive relationship. And today in episode 2, we're going to focus a bit more on family law and how the family law remedies do or don't alleviate some of the challenges and the barriers that we see in the housing realities, and how survivors are using family law or how abusers are using family law to make it a bit more difficult. So welcome back, Haley.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Great to be back.
Great to have you back.
We're so happy you're here. This is great.
This is a very tough topic. I think it was tough for all three of us in episode 1 as well. And just a reminder to everyone to take care as you're listening through these really challenging issues. And it is a reality for a lot of folks, a lot of the people that we support. But I think what Stephanie and I just wanted to reiterate is that the reason why we're doing this podcast is to make sure that more people are aware of these challenges, because a lot of it is hidden. A lot of it is seen as a private matter between two people when it isn't.
Yeah, and like we talked about in the first season as well, there are so many people who maybe know someone going through the family law system, but they don't really understand why it's taking so long or why that person is struggling so much. And so probably the only thing worse than all of these difficult situations existing is no one talking about them. So we're hoping that by talking about them, we can kind of shine a light on what's happening, but also create a bit of understanding for everyone about why it's so tough and why it's so hard for the family law system to respond effectively as well. These are really complicated situations. And I think your research, Haley, has shown that, intersecting with looking at the overlaps with the housing crisis in BC and kind of overlaying that. It really does highlight how there's no one solution for everyone. And there's no one response that's the right response. It's just really, really complicated.
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Haley.
Oh, that's
Jump
okay.
in.
Okay, sure. I was just going to say that absolutely. And I know, or one of the things that, I find so inspiring about your work, Stephanie and Vicky, on this podcast is you're taking really complicated legal topics and trying to break them down so that everyone can understand to better, support maybe people in their life that are going through this. And one thing that I know is that, I'll just start maybe by saying something really positive that came from this project is the impact that friends and family can have on a survivor of violence in a really good way. So friends and family are often, serving as emergency shelters for people who are leaving and who need a place to stay, and or they're, providing some financial support, they're helping them get a lawyer, they're doing all of these things. And when family and friends can respond and, in a non-judgmental way and with some understanding of what people are going through, with understanding of family violence, it has a really positive impact. And people don't necessarily have to, be housing other people to have a positive impact. Understanding where people are coming from and their situations is really, really huge. And, that's, I think, part of what's so incredible about having conversations like this, is kind of demystifying potentially what that looks like for people. And also, we just know from the statistics that it's not if you know someone, it's really who you may know that's going through this.
Yeah.
Well, that is nice.
I'm going to be the downer here because we talk about friends and family. I'm going to be the downer.
Yeah.
Because we know isolation, like you talked about, Haley, in the previous episode, like isolation is a huge factor in coercive and controlling behavior, and is part of a tactic of abuse that where the perpetrator will isolate the individuals physically, like moving them away to an area where it's physically isolated. But there's also the emotional, psychological isolation of like removing their friends and family as a source of support, so that the survivor does not have a network to reach out to when they need it. So I just want to acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, someone may be thinking, well, that would never happen to me. I would always check in on my friends or my family. But, abusers do things like monitoring the devices. They, suddenly are looking at all the texts. They have the access to the phone. They're telling the survivor that they're really jealous anytime they send texts to their friends, and they're making it really, difficult to have those conversations. So that is, that's something that's going on. And I just think it also really speaks to how abusers know that family and friends could be there to help this person. And the social isolation is a deliberate tactic to attempt to further control them.
Yeah. And it can be really intimidating for friends and family, supporting someone that they care about, hearing about all the horrible things that have happened, and then think, well, now I'm going to put myself out there as a target for this person who's quite dangerous or intimidating. It is really, really challenging to be there. So I do agree. This is a really hopeful piece, Haley, to that friends and family who lean in and help are that bright spot and really make a difference for survivors.
Yeah, and that just reminded me something I haven't spoken yet, in presentations or anything on this project. But one thing that abusers also do is they threaten family. So they'll say like,
right.
And I'm just thinking of one of the people I spoke to who, someone very close to her abuser physically assaulted them. And that was very much a direct violence to that person, but it was also this intimidation to her. Like, if you ever reach out to them, this is kind of what happens. And so people are really scared often for how, if they reach out to people in their social networks, that those people could be, victims of violence from their abuser. So they're often navigating, keeping themselves safe, but also keeping people that they care about safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Very good point.
It goes back to the complications of this area and the need for safety planning, and how safety planning can be so complicated, because it's not, as we've mentioned before, just leaving the house or leaving the abusive relationship. There's so many intricacies that come into play. I think one of those intricacies that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is money. And the lack of money, or the lack of access to finances and resources for a survivor when they leave an abusive relationship. And this is really tied into the housing crisis, and how a survivor and their children navigate trying to find another place to stay when they've left the abusive relationship.
Yeah. So one thing that I mentioned in the last episode is how within this project, which we had the opportunity to do a really in-depth look at how survivors of violence are navigating the housing crisis and going through family law matters. And we did this with funding from the same foundation. We've had the chance to better understand what they're navigating and where does the family law system fit into that. So picking back up on what you've said, Vicky, about, money. So economic abuse is extremely common, and it's common in a relationship, and it's common after relationships end. So I'll just give some kind of examples of what that could look like. So in a relationship, that can look like a person not being allowed access to the bank accounts, not being allowed to work, maybe being allowed some access to money, but, only when they're behaving quote unquote good, or maybe being allowed to work a bit, but, always sort of having a threat that they're not going to be able to continue working. So that can look very different, but depending on different situations, but basically not having agency over the family money, not having any real control or access, or kind of the threat of that being taken away at any point. One thing that happens a lot is, people will get kind of cut off of the bank account if they sort of are seen to have done something wrong. So this constant control over the money. And what this means is people are often leaving abusive relationships without bank accounts, without any money, or with very limited savings. And as we can all appreciate, if you snap your fingers and have to leave your house with your kids, the clothes on your back, a big question mark is going to be, how can you afford to, or where are you going to go, and how are you going to afford it? And people in these situations are, often entitled to family law remedies like child support, like spousal support, the division of the family bank accounts and potentially the home. Like, these are all things that they are entitled to in law, but we know that without money, it's really hard to get those things. So the economic abuse often is continuing after separation. So abusers will often say things to people like, you're never going to see a dime from me. You chose to leave, so I don't have to pay for the kids, and all of those pieces. And so our report really focuses on what types of changes do we need to see so that people who are in most need of those financial remedies can get them.
Yeah, it's, I think in our financial abuse episode last season, Vicky, we talked a little bit about why there's such a disconnect between how people use money, especially abusive parties using money in real life versus what family law lays out. And that this disconnect really kind of comes from what people are entitled to under the law versus what an abusive party thinks is reasonable. And in our society, money typically buys you either a good or a service. And so it doesn't make sense in someone's brain, especially if they are trying to exert control. And this could be really deliberate on their part, or it could be subconscious for them, that they're like, why am I shelling out my hard-earned money? I'm stereotyping a little bit here, that they're the higher income earner, my money for nothing. Like you said, Haley, the bad behavior gets punished with money being withheld, or, what they view as being bad behavior. And it's so deeply entrenched in stereotypes about how someone is supposed to behave, and about basically abusive parties being allowed to keep going and perpetrate this kind of control. And I don't think family law is quite caught up with that dynamic yet. I think there's still an assumption that there's like this fairness that if someone's entitled to something, they're going to get it. But also what you said, Haley, about if you don't have the money to fight for your entitlement, how do you get that entitlement? Vicky, you look like you're going to jump in.
Yeah, well, because you talk about the disconnect between the entitlement and what the abuser thinks is appropriate, right? Like, or what the abuser believes that the survivor should be entitled to. And we're all now talking about the disconnect between what the family law entitlement says a survivor can be entitled to, and then the gap on how a survivor can access that entitlement, right? So this goes back to what Haley's talking about, that it takes money to access those entitlements. And this is like a common saying, it takes money to get money. But it is like it's so true here. And we don't need to repeat everything we've said in the last season, but the difficulties of navigating through the family law system and how it is so complex for survivors to to just get the resources that they're entitled to. So maybe let's like dig into a little bit more there. Like, Haley, it takes money to get money. What are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a big focus of mine and this project on housing. It's also something that I am focusing on my PhD at UBC, where I'm studying economic abuse and child support. So one of the biggest barriers is in Canada, we have this what's called an applications-based child support system. So what that means is if you want child support, unless the other party agrees, which, lots of people do agree, it should be very easy to determine how much child support's owed. There's lots of free and accessible tools for people when they separate to figure that all out. And so lots of people don't need to go to court to figure out child support. However, if the person isn't agreeing, which most abusers are going to continue to try and assert power after separation, and this is one of the ways that they do it. They don't want to pay child support, and the survivor then has to bring an application for child support. And what we know is that for many people, this is going to be too dangerous for them to do. Just the act of bringing an application is going to put them in an unsafe situation. They're scared what's going to happen. And oftentimes they're very aware that as soon as they bring this application, the abusive party is going to say, well, I want more time with the kids then, basically as a bit of a revenge. And to them, that's not worth it. They would rather live without that child support than put their children at risk of more parenting time with that person. So we know that people are giving up child support all the time. And we also know that even when people are deciding, you know what, I'm going to ask for it. I already am asking for other legal remedies, typically parenting time. So I may as well ask for it. They face so many barriers because it's expensive to go to court. The abusive party uses the whole process to their advantage. They do things like not giving their financial disclosure, refusing to pay, trying to make it look like they're earning less. Suddenly they're quitting their job. All of these tactics to basically try and avoid paying. And I'll just go back to something you said, Stephanie, about, unconscious or conscious, I'm not super, I don't focus a lot in my work on, abusers' motivations, but what I do think about a lot is why do we have a setup right now that gives all this space to what they want to do and what they don't want to do it. Child support is the right of the children, whether or not it's conscious or not about why they have decided to not pay. This whole approach really gives them so much power. And in my view, it's actually reinforcing the abusive dynamic where survivors are trying to get the support their children are entitled to, and pretzeling themselves often into these really complex situations where they're having to ask their abusers for money.
Right. And this is a good point that the motivation is secondary, that all of the hurdles and the space for neutrality in the court system is the primary
Mhm.
concern. Yeah.
Yeah. The law doesn't care about motivation. The law says
No.
the child gets this. This is the right of the child, like you say, Haley, right? Like that's what matters. And it's based on a calculation of the payer, usually the perpetrator's income. And this is why I want to go back to what you're saying, Haley, about the need for financial disclosure and connecting that back to the coercive and controlling bit, which is that, like, remember when Haley spoke about someone in an abusive relationship, they don't have access to finances, or they may have very limited access. A type of financial control that we often see is that the survivor actually has no idea, no information about what the family's finances are like. And so when they are navigating this litigation process to ask for child support, the survivor actually has no information to give to the court about what should be paid or how much should be paid, and is relying on the person who doesn't want to pay to provide that type of information before the court can make an order. And so we're in this like cycle of abuse, where the survivor is not able to afford the basic necessities for themselves and their children.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of bring it back to, why we're here. We're talking about housing and the implications of family law on people's housing security. So what we know is that, child support, when paid regularly and in the amount that's supposed to be paid, this is going to go towards people's rent. But if someone doesn't know whether or not they will receive child support if they leave, that's actually a factor in their decision to stay longer in an abusive relationship. So family law and family law remedies are not these neutral secondary pieces to safety. They actually have huge implications on people's real everyday decisions about where they're going to live. And if we had a better functioning child support system, for example, this would affect people's housing security. And so in the report, we go through all of the family law remedies, and why they aren't currently best supporting survivors and how that affects their safety. And we also make a series of recommendations. We're just talking right now about child support because it's one of the big ones.
Mm-hmm. And you say we need a better child support system. Like, do you know what that would look like?
Yeah.
What's a better system?
Yeah, well, I mentioned how it's applications based right now. So we are putting all this work on survivors and we're giving all this power to the payers. So let's switch that and have a guaranteed child support system model. So what that looks like is the survivor leaves the relationship. She's entitled to child support. It is the government agency who basically advances that payment and gives that money to her. And then it is the government agency to work to get reimbursed by the payer. And this is sort of the model that they have in Norway. It would require some pretty significant changes, but I think that it would make so much more sense, and it would better serve children and better serve survivors. Right now, there's $3.7 billion in outstanding child support in Canada, and that's just the amount that's been ordered, let alone all the survivors who have given up their child support.
Sorry, say that number again. How much is owed?
3.7 billion in arrears. So that's the amount that's been ordered that hasn't been paid, because we have really great enforcement agencies throughout Canada that can do a lot to enforce orders, but abusers can basically avoid those in many situations. So it's imperfect for sure.
And not to put you on the spot if you don't know the answer to this, Haley, but do you know what the gender breakdown of who is the payer, who is the recipient in that 3.7 billion?
I think it's 97% of all child support orders are made to women as recipients. But but I could find the exact number.
That's okay. We weren't prepared. I wasn't preparing to ask you this question, so I didn't expect you to prepare. But like, we know, like, a society, we know that men are generally the higher income earners, and that when parties separate, you know, there are statistics about how women lose more of their income or are more in debt or have less financial resources.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at the 3.7 billion, I can only imagine that it's.
Oh, here we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry
Well,
to interrupt. Okay. 96% of cases of registered
96.
maintenance enforcement programs involve male payers paying female recipients.
Right. And this supports the gendered language that we tend to use around abusive behaviors, because the statistics are demonstrating that it's, primarily this direction.
96% of 3.7 billion.
Yeah, that is a shocking amount, hey?
Yeah, to be fair, I think those two things might be separate, but I think it's fair to say overwhelmingly,
Right.
the orders made are dads pay child support, and for all the pieces you mentioned, Vicky, like, we know that it is still women who primarily are doing most of the childcare obligations. That has huge impacts on people's employment. Economic abuse within abusive relationships has a profound impact on people's economic situations for often the rest of their lives. If you're not allowed to work, if you that will have a really big impact on your opportunities to excel in the workforce after your abusive relationship ends. And in addition to other pieces, like trying to find jobs that fit within the very limited hours of kids going to school. Not many jobs do that, and not many of those jobs are high earning jobs.
Right.
That allow the flexibility you need when you're a caregiver to children.
Yeah. And I think probably anecdotally, most of us who are familiar or have a friend or family member who is struggling with some kind of financial abuse, then it's normally a female friend or family member. So even if those statistics aren't exactly, like you said, linked to one another, most people listening will probably be able to relate to that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the deeper dive on the financial link with housing and the recommendations that you're making specifically around child support. Are there other recommendations that really kind of got you excited or you're interested in sharing?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the pieces about this work that's really exciting is I hope that it opens sort of this opportunity for family law professionals to really understand the role that they play in creating a better family law system and how that will have direct impacts on people's housing security. So, I kind of start always by saying I'm not asking family law lawyers or judges or police officers to be out there building houses or putting roofs over people's head, but we have to recognize that when all of these pieces of family law are failing people, that actually is going to affect their decision to stay in abusive relationships longer or return to them. So some of those pieces, for example, are protection orders. If you can't get a protection order, that might mean that you're the person who has to flee in the night, leave the home. You're the one who has to, have all this upfront cost of moving. You have to find somewhere safe. You can't necessarily relocate. That's another big challenge that people experience going through the family law process. If you're leaving the shared home, how are you going to get, the division of that home if you can't afford to bring an application for division of family property? And so people are potentially, walking away from a life-changing amount of money and financial security because they can't afford to go through a family law process to have access to, for example, equity in the family home. So one of the, I mean, it's just sort of big picture. What makes me excited about this is because so many survivors explained that, this question of should I have just stayed, and they're now navigating these really complex processes that aren't necessarily putting them in safer positions. What, excites me is these opportunities to have systems where people don't have to ask that question because the family law system is there for them and it understands their needs. It's low barrier, it's quick, it gives them answers, it gives them the financial entitlements they need to actually do things like pay rent. And I think there's just so many opportunities for improvements that would have a really big impact.
Right. And that's a very positive spin on all of your findings, because you did dig quite deeply into a lot of the challenges that survivors were facing. So I do hope people read the report. But do you have any final thoughts or anything that you didn't feel you had a chance to share yet that you do want to talk about before we finish up for today? We had talked kind of in between recording the first episode and the second about how depressing this can really get, and that we were like, we need to find some hope. And I think you've just naturally done that, Haley, with a lot of the recommendations and the opportunities for improvement that you've outlined. Because although it does feel like a big redesign of our current family law system, at the same time, there are some small steps to take in the beginning towards that ultimate goal that I think every step that we take makes a difference, right? So I do appreciate that there are such tangible recommendations in your research as well. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah. Well, I know I mentioned friends and family at the beginning and how, what a big impact they have, and transition houses and the work of anti-violence organizations and any type of existing financial supports. These were really positive findings from the project. People really talked about how the transition house and transition house staff saved their life, and these different organizations doing incredible work, often understaffed and under-resourced. And I guess one piece is that I think that if we could have a family law system that shifts its perspective to understanding how the challenges really affect safety. So, for example, denying someone a protection order, or telling someone who's applying for a protection order without notice that they have to serve the other party. If we could have a better understanding of how that's going to affect that person's housing and what it's going to be like for them if they have to serve their abuser that they currently share their 1-bedroom apartment with, how that's going to go for them. I think that just that in and of itself would be huge. And like I mentioned, there's lots of different specifics for how that could work, but kind of big picture, despite all the challenges, we find ourselves in a very hopeful time in BC. I think I'm extremely inspired by the work of the provincial government. They have so many initiatives with direction from the Attorney General of BC to try to, redesign our Family Law Act, to modernize it, to be more in line with what families are really experiencing and going through. And also, I know that, the last episode of your season 1 was all about Dr. Stanton's review of how to improve the legal system for survivors of violence. And we are, at this time, we have this incredible roadmap that's evidence-based. She looked at all that exists, all the recommendations ever made, and has, really drafted a guide for what the province needs to do to improve outcomes in the criminal process and in the family law process. And I know that the province is already underway in enacting a lot of those recommendations. So while there's big challenges, there's also clearly big motivations and ambitions from the province to improve this, which I find, just extremely hopeful, and I just really am in awe, actually, of all the work that's been done, just even in the past 1 year.
Yeah, I think we totally agree. It's extremely encouraging, and yeah, we hope that we can just keep moving.
Yeah, Dr. Stanton really did provide us with a roadmap on how to make changes. So we're not starting from a blank slate, right? Like we know it's an instruction guide. We can follow it. We know how to make things better. So thank you. I was
just going to say, Vicky, I wonder if we should also link Dr. Stanton's report in the show notes for this episode as well.
Yeah.
Is that what you were going to say too?
No, but that's a great idea. And I think for folks who are interested to learn more about Dr. Stanton's report, there's Dr. Stanton wrote a full report and also an executive summary. And we also discussed some of her recommendations in our final episode of season 1 of this podcast. So those are all available to everyone to take a look at.
I'll just add that the final report came out while I was writing our housing report. So I also worked to make sure that we endorse all of her recommendations, but we, have them throughout the report as well. So they're very much overlapped and in line.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Haley, for being here today and for talking about all of your findings in particular. I think it's really useful for our audience to hear about it. We've talked about in the last episode some of the training that's available to lawyers, but really the podcast is meant to reach a wider audience and just speak more openly and more plainly about some of the challenges. For me, the title still sticks with me. The Should I Have Just Stayed is really impactful as a title. And I hope that one of the major takeaways that people have is how logical it is for someone to stay in an abusive situation, not just for the housing challenge, but also for all the other reasons we've discussed, but that also they may go back. So hopefully that is something that that kind of underlines and dispels some of the myths around leaving abuse. And we're just going to keep talking on similar topics as we move forward through season 2. So we'll see everyone next time for episode 3. Thanks for being with us today.
Everything that we have said today is not legal advice. If you or someone you know needs legal advice, please consult with a lawyer. We want to acknowledge that this podcast would not be possible without the generous contribution by Women and Gender Equality Canada, Femmes et Égalité des Genres Canada.